For many years, Sarah Ferguson didn't talk about Andrew. She stayed with him through many problems and protected her daughters from the worst of it. But things have changed. A story has been building privately about trust being broken, secrets, and what Andrew supposedly did to the girls he was supposed to protect. Now Fergie is talking, and what she said has really shocked the royal family. With things getting more tense and the full truth coming out, many people are asking how it got this bad. So what really happened? Let's look at the whole story. Andrew was an absent father. To understand how Andrew was with his daughters, it helps to first look at his marriage to their mother. The ways he acted as a father were already clear before his daughters were born. Andrew married Sarah Ferguson on July 23, 1986. It was a big wedding at Westminster Abbey, and millions watched. She was in her mid-20s, lively and natural, different from the usual royal image. He was the Queen's second son, confident in his Navy uniform, and had just been made Duke of York. At the time, people saw them as a happy and promising couple, but their marriage quickly became more complicated. Andrew's job in the Royal Navy meant he was often away for a long time. Months would go by with little talking. He wasn't there for much of their life together. Meanwhile, Sarah entered a very strict and demanding world. She left her independence and job behind. She was expected to get used to royal life, handle a lot of public attention, and follow strict rules, all without much help from her husband. In later talks, Sarah said that in the early years of their marriage, they spent very little time together. Over 5 years, they were only in the same place for a small part of each year. This meant she faced big life moments mostly by herself, like being pregnant and being a new mother. She was raising young children while also learning how to live within one of the most watched families in the world. This situation made her very sad and tired, and people around her could see it. People who visited the palace back then said Sarah Ferguson seemed alone and overwhelmed. Even though she lived in a grand place, she didn't have the personal support that might have made things easier. They only spent a small amount of time together in those early years. Over 5 years, Andrew and Sarah were in the same place for about 40 days each year. This was during some of the most important times of her life, like when she was pregnant with Princess Beatrice and later while taking care of a baby and then a toddler. At the same time, she was trying to find her place in the British royal family, a system with strict rules, constant public attention, and very little advice on how to handle it all. People who saw her during that time noticed how stressed she was. A journalist named Jenny Murray later talked about visiting her at Buckingham Palace in 1989 and being surprised by how hard things seemed. She remembered at first thinking Sarah was a staff member because she was in casual clothes. This showed how different her real life was from what the public saw. What stood out most was how alone she seemed. She was raising a young child mostly by herself and wasn't included in her husband's trips, making her unsure about his life when he was away. This time set the stage for what came next. Their marriage was less about arguments and more about being far apart and absent. Sarah did most of the work at home, while Andrew's role stayed mostly separate. Years later, he would say in a TV interview that he clearly remembered being at home with his daughters on a certain day. However, that claim goes against a much longer pattern, where he was often not there during their early childhood. Sarah and Andrew separated in 1992. Princess Beatrice was 4 years old and Princess Eugenie was 2. By then, the distance that had shaped their marriage was impossible to ignore. Even when Andrew was still living in the same house, it often felt like he wasn't really there. And that absence hurt his children in ways that are rarely talked about publicly. So keep watching because it gets really intense from here. 40 days a year might sound like a simple number, but it doesn't show what it feels like to grow up in a home where a father is more like a visitor than someone who is always there. That experience is better understood through the lives of his daughters, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie. Beatrice was born in 1988, and Eugenie followed in 1990. By the time Eugenie was old enough to remember things, her parents had already separated. This meant that for most of their childhood, their father was not consistently present. He showed up for official duties, public events, and moments that were photographed, but he was mostly absent from the normal daily life that helps a child feel safe and stable. The everyday parts of parenting, the routines that often go unnoticed, were not something they regularly did with him. There were no consistent school drop-offs, no steady help with homework, no regular attendance at school events, or quiet evenings at home. These small, repeated moments are what build familiarity and trust. In this case, they were mostly missing from his role as a father. Instead, that job fell almost entirely on their mother, Sarah Ferguson. She managed their upbringing mostly by herself within the unusual setting of royal homes, while also facing a lot of public criticism. The pressure of constant media attention did not make her responsibilities lighter. If anything, it made them harder. Despite that, she remained a constant person in her daughters' lives. Clues about how this affected them can be seen in how they talk about their childhood as adults. Eugenie, for example, has talked about her experience with scoliosis as a child. She described how her mother noticed the problem early and supported her through treatment and recovery. She has stressed how her mother helped her feel confident, especially in learning to accept and be proud of her body after surgery. When telling that story, the focus stays completely on her mother's role. Not a word about her father. A medical problem at 12, an operation, a recovery, a lifetime of learning to walk with confidence. And in Eugenie's own telling of that story, Andrew is not in it. The person who noticed, who acted, who helped her feel good about herself after it all, that was Ferguson. That was always Ferguson. Beatrice told the same story from a different way. When she was on This Morning, in May 2024, to talk about her mother's recovery from cancer, she described Ferguson as someone whose strength keeps her going. She called her an amazing icon. She talked about everything her mother had been through and how she was now, at 64, truly becoming herself. It was the kind of praise you give to someone who was there for the important things, who showed up without being asked, who did the work when no one was watching. Andrew's name didn't come up. He had the title. He had the pictures and the uniform and the fancy events where he stood in the right place at the right time. But the person who raised Beatrice and Eugenie, who noticed the illness, who was there through the recovery, who built their confidence and kept the household stable through many years of public trouble, was the woman he had left to manage it alone. His daughters grew up knowing the difference between a father who was there on paper and one who was there in real life. And the way they talk about their parents now, the warmth they save only for their mother, the silence they keep about their father, tells you everything about what kind of father Andrew was. But it didn't stop with him being neglectful. So keep watching, because what came next made all of that look small in comparison. Andrew's friendship with Epstein and what it did to his daughters. While Andrew was creating distance within his own family, he was also making friends elsewhere, relationships that would later cause serious problems. At the same time, he was figuring out his public image after leaving the Navy. He became very close to a man many people already saw with suspicion, Jeffrey Epstein. That relationship would eventually fall apart in a way that not only hurt Andrew's reputation, but also pulled his daughters into a situation they couldn't control. Andrew first met Epstein in 1999. At that time, Epstein was known for his money and powerful friends, moving in important social groups across the United States and Europe. Even then, there were worries about how he acted, though the full extent of his crimes wasn't widely known yet. Andrew, like others in similar groups, was attracted to the access and influence Epstein seemed to offer. Over time, their friendship grew stronger and more visible. The big change happened in 2008 when Epstein admitted guilt in Florida to charges involving a minor. He spent a short time in prison, and by that point many people stayed away from him. Andrew did not. Instead, Prince Andrew kept in touch and in 2010 visited Epstein at his home in New York. This decision received a lot of criticism later because it happened after Epstein's conviction was already public knowledge. What makes this situation more troubling is how Andrew's personal relationships started to mix with his family life. Stories that came out years later suggested that his daughters, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, were indirectly brought into his social world. For example, it was reported that family photos of the young princesses were included in letters sent to Epstein even after he was found guilty. While there's no sign the daughters knew about this, it showed how Andrew's choices blurred the lines between his private friends and his role as a father. There were also social connections that raised questions. People connected to Epstein's group were reportedly present at events linked to Andrew and his family. One example involved gatherings around important family milestones where controversial people were included in the wider social circle. For Beatrice, moments that should have been purely personal, like celebrations marking adulthood, became indirectly tied to her father's friends. Another example often mentioned is Andrew's connection to people outside Epstein's group whose pasts were also questionable. Gifts and invitations involving such figures added to the feeling that his judgment about who to bring into his family's world was sometimes deeply flawed. These were not decisions his daughters could control. Yet, they were the ones whose lives were affected by the public exposure that followed. By the time more detailed information about Epstein became widely available years later, the impact on Andrew's family was impossible to avoid. When documents related to Epstein were made public, reports suggested that both Beatrice and Eugenie were shocked by what they learned. They had mostly stayed quiet in public, but sources close to them described feelings of disbelief and sadness. The situation was no longer just about their father's reputation. It had become part of their own story in the eyes of the public. The situation got worse in November 2019 when Andrew agreed to a TV interview with Emily Maitlis on BBC Newsnight. The interview was meant to answer growing questions about his connection to Epstein. Instead, it became a moment that made public scrutiny even more intense. During the interview, Andrew denied doing anything wrong and rejected claims made by Virginia Gioffer, who said she had been trafficked to him as a minor. He said he didn't remember meeting her and offered explanations that were widely questioned by both the public and experts. Among these was a claim about a medical condition affecting his ability to sweat, which was met with doubt from doctors. However, the most talked-about part of the interview was the alibi he gave. Andrew said he couldn't have been present at a certain time because he was elsewhere with his daughter Beatrice at a restaurant in Woking. He presented this as a clear and specific memory, suggesting it proved he was innocent. The response was immediate and harsh. Public reaction to the interview was very negative. Media coverage became more intense. Sponsors and organizations quickly pulled away, and within days, Andrew stepped back from public royal duties. Over time, he lost his official jobs, military titles, and patronages. What was meant to fix his image instead made it collapse faster. For his daughters, the situation created a different kind of pressure. Beatrice's name had been used publicly as part of her father's defense, putting her directly into a worldwide controversy without any sign she had chosen to be involved. Events from her past, including important celebrations, were looked at again and understood differently because of the Epstein scandal. This kind of exposure can be very unsettling, especially when it connects personal memories to public controversy. Reports at the time suggested that both sisters were under a lot of emotional stress. They were dealing with the consequences while trying to appear calm in public, as expected of members of the royal family. At the same time, they had to deal with the personal impact of the situation privately, mostly supported by their immediate families and partners. What makes this time especially important is how it combines two things that had already been present in Andrew's life: distance within his family and bad judgment in his outside relationships. These things came together in a way that directly affected his daughters, not because of what they did, but because of things they couldn't control. Beatrice and Eugenie did not choose the people their father associated with, nor did they cause the decisions that led to public scandal. Yet they became part of the story, both in media coverage and in how people saw them. Their lives, which had already been shaped by an unusual upbringing, were made even more complicated by events that put their family under intense scrutiny. The long-term effects of this are hard to know from the outside. What can be seen, however, is how both women have continued to stay relatively out of the public eye compared to other members of the royal family, focusing on their own jobs and families. When they do speak publicly, they tend to talk about stability, strength, and the importance of close personal relationships, values that show the environment in which they were raised. And that is why Sarah Ferguson is speaking up now, and what she has to say will surprise you. What Fergie said on live TV and what she stopped saying. For years, Sarah Ferguson had a way of doing things, and she stuck to it very consistently. No matter what the newspapers said, no matter what new information came out, she would sit in front of a camera and give the same main message. Andrew was a good man, a loving father, a person who was misunderstood and deserved the benefit of the doubt. She said it on Good Morning Britain. She said it in magazine articles. She said it at charity events and on daytime TV shows across Britain and America. The way she did things never changed because for a long time she believed it was the right thing to do. But ways of doing things can reach a breaking point. As the Epstein files became more serious and the titles disappeared and the arrest became real, something in how Ferguson chose to speak began to change. Not suddenly, not in one big interview that the world could point to as the moment she changed. It happened the way most real things happen, quietly, slowly, and by many small things that only become clear when you step back and look at all of them together. She stopped including him in the picture, especially after he used Beatrice as a defense. That might sound like a small thing. It was not. When Ferguson spoke about the hardest years of her life, the cancer diagnosis, the operations, the recovery, she described who was there. She described who supported her. And the answer every single time was her daughters, not Andrew, not the man she had continued to defend publicly for 3 decades, her girls. She gave that picture a name. She called the 3 of them a tripod. Herself, Beatrice and Eugenie. 3 women, she said, supporting each other through good times and bad. It was a warm image. It was also a precise one. A tripod has 3 legs, not 4, and the person missing from that count was not left out by accident. In 2024, speaking to Platinum magazine about her daughter's support through her cancer battle, she said her girls had been rock solid. She described them as her anchor through the most frightening period of her recent life. She spoke about their loyalty and their consistency and the way they showed up without being asked. Andrew was not in that conversation. The clearest moment came not from Ferguson herself, but from Beatrice. When she appeared on This Morning in May 2024 to talk about her mother's recovery, she spoke about Ferguson with the kind of warmth that is only possible when someone has truly earned it. She called her an amazing icon. She described her strength as something that keeps her going personally. She said her mother, at 64, was finally truly becoming herself. It was a long interview. Andrew's name did not come up once. That silence from a daughter speaking publicly about her family on national television told the story more clearly than any direct statement could have. Ferguson had spent 30 years managing what was said about Andrew. Now, her own daughter was on live television talking about their family, and he was not part of the picture she chose to paint. What Ferguson eventually did say in the times between the carefully managed public appearances was darker. Sources close to the family described her as heartbroken after the arrest. She was scared not just for Andrew, but for herself. The Epstein documents had mentioned her own messages. Her charity had closed. Her title was gone. Her home at Royal Lodge had been taken back. She had built a whole new life around the image of a changed, strong woman who had survived the worst the tabloids could throw at her. And now that image was falling apart alongside his. She went into hiding. First the Austrian Alps, then France, then the United Arab Emirates, and the trio she had described so warmly in interviews, the 3 women who supported each other, was left standing without her. Beatrice and Eugenie kept going. They attended royal events. They protected their children. They said nothing publicly about their father or their mother. 3 women who had spent their entire lives dealing with the results of other people's choices, still doing exactly that. But the story is far from over. Stay with us as we look at how the kids are reacting to everything. The impact of Andrew's actions. Eugenie cuts contact. Beatrice keeps her distance. By the beginning of 2026, the distance between Andrew and his daughters was no longer something guessed or quietly noticed. It was being openly reported. In January, many news sources reported that Princess Eugenie had completely stopped talking to her father. According to those reports, she had not visited him during Christmas and was no longer speaking to him. The story was talked about publicly on Good Morning Britain, where Susanna Reid discussed it directly on air. Commentators suggested that Eugenie's absence from her father's side, especially during a time like Christmas, which is usually focused on family, was not by accident or just a symbol. It showed a deeper change. Royal expert Afua Hagen noted that while private support can never be fully ruled out, public actions often tell their own story. In this case, Eugenie's decision to stay separate from her father in public settings pointed to a clear line being drawn. That line seemed to be based not just on personal feelings, but on values. The idea was that at a certain point, keeping distance becomes less about loyalty and more about what a person is willing to be connected to, especially when public life and reputation are involved. For someone like Eugenie, who had spent her whole life being watched, that difference was very important. Princess Beatrice, on the other hand, seemed to take a more careful approach. She had not completely cut ties and continued to keep some contact. In December 2025, Beatrice invited her father to the christening of her daughter, a private family event. But even that moment was carefully controlled. There were no public photos of them together, no shared appearances, and no statements that might be seen as a broader show of support. The invitation itself was a minimal gesture, acknowledging a personal connection without making it public. Then in February 2026, the situation got much worse. Andrew was arrested at his home on his 66th birthday, an event that immediately got a lot of attention. The circumstances of the arrest, linked to ongoing scrutiny around his past associations, brought the issue back into headlines with new intensity. In the immediate aftermath, both Beatrice and Eugenie remained silent. There were no public statements, no visible responses, and no attempts to defend or explain. Instead, they stayed out of sight. Reports suggested that their upcoming plans had been changed, with appearances rethought and schedules altered. The focus, it seemed, had shifted toward dealing with the impact rather than directly engaging with the controversy. Sources close to the situation described their reaction in strong terms, not as defensive or dismissive, but as deeply upset. There was a sense of worry, not only about what had already happened, but about what might still come out. That kind of response suggests a gap between what they expected and what actually happened, where events unfold in ways that force them to rethink what they thought they knew. The consequences did not stay only in private life. They followed both women into their public roles, affecting how they were seen and where they were able to appear. One of the clearest examples came with reports that they had been excluded from Royal Ascot in 2026. The decision, according to news at the time, was connected to the wider fallout from their families' connections. For Beatrice and Eugenie, this meant losing access to an event that had long been part of royal tradition. It was not a decision they had made, but one that was made about them. Despite having their own careers, charity work, and independent lives, they were still being judged because of their father's actions. Commentators described this as part of a bigger problem, the burden of a family name. The York name, which had once meant status and recognition, had become increasingly complicated. For the daughters, it was not something they could put aside. It was tied to who they are, their history, and their public roles. What makes this situation particularly difficult is the lack of control. Beatrice and Eugenie did not create the decisions that led to the controversy, yet they continue to feel its effects. Their choices now involve how to respond, how to balance personal relationships with public responsibility, and how to move forward in a situation they did not create. For Beatrice and Eugenie, the challenge now is not just about staying away from controversy, but about figuring out who they are within it and deciding what parts of that legacy they are willing to carry forward. And that is all because of what their father did to them. So what do you think? Looking at it all together, does it change how you see him? And which moment hit you differently? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives, and click the next video. You will love it.